In 1960, only 5% of Americans were upset with their child marrying someone from the opposing party. In 2010, that figure has jumped to 1/3 of Democrats and 1/2 of Republicans. Today, we are looking at the top cited paper since 2010 in all the annual review volumes of political science, the top doc, the numero uno guy for number of citations. And this review paper deals with one of the biggest, if not the biggest issue in current political science research. And this is the fact that everybody, but especially Americans, seems to hate each other more and more across party lines. We don't really hear a lot of political YouTubers talk about this. I wish they did so a bit more, because I think it's very important. Okay, so the article starts out by stating something interesting, and that is the fact that on the actual issues, we don't seem to have changed much since the 1960s. We are basically as divided as we have ever been. Maybe there's been a slight increase, but the evidence is kind of mixed. While unfortunately, the data for the fact that we hate each other more and more is pretty clear. In another study, they asked participants to select between two candidates for a college scholarship. Now, these two candidates had similar academic credentials, but they differed on one key aspect. One was a Democrat and one was a Republican. About 80% of Democrats selected the Democratic applicant. About 80% of Republicans selected the Republican one. But it gets worse. These results held even when the out-party candidate had a significantly higher grade point average. The probability of a partisan selecting the more qualified candidate, but was not of his own party, was never above 30%. The increased dislike of people in other parties is called affective polarization, while the division on the issues is called issue polarization. Affective polarization has been increasing a lot, issue polarization, the evidence is more mixed. Here, you can see a graph of how affective polarization has been increasing over time. And as you can notice, it's basically since the half 1970s that we have been having constant increases, maybe accelerating in the past decade or so. So we increasingly hate each other more and more over time for the past 50 years. Is this ever going to stop? Affective polarization in this graph is measured by asking respondents how warm or cold do they feel towards people in opposing parties, from a scale to 1 to 100. So basically, researchers are going around asking people to rate each other on a hotness scale.
I want you to rate me and my friends here 1 through 10.
But the big mystery is what's causing these constant increases in affective polarization. They are so constant over time that it seems like there might be some physical underlying mechanism that's causing us to hate each other more and more. And it would be important to discover, if this mechanism exists, what it is, so we could, stop doing it. Perhaps the most accredited hypothesis floating around is that affective polarization is caused by partisan sorting. Allow me to explain. Tip tip. It seems like people can have different partisan and ideological identities. Sorting occurs when these two identities align. A partisan identity is basically the political team you feel more affiliated with. You perceive yourself to be a Republican or a Democrat in America. It should be thought of as an emotional attachment, a group attachment, while an ideological identity refers to which coherent political ideology you subscribe to in your actual view on issues. So this could be conservative, progressive, or liberal. Now, when I was first reading this research, it seemed a bit strange to me that these two things could be separated, the partisan identity and the ideological identity. I thought that a Republican is basically always going to be a conservative, and a Democrat is going to be like a progressive or a liberal. So these things are always going to be aligned. But actually, there's some pretty convincing research that shows that often these things are not aligned. I think it's probably due to the fact that people don't really think about their coherent political ideology a lot during their day. They mostly have a party affiliation, an emotional attachment to people in their group, and you don't really think about this coherent ideology all the time. And so on the actual issues, you might not be a Democrat or a conservative, even if your identity is that of a Democrat or a conservative. The important thing to understand is that when one is sorted, when his partisan and ideological identities align, well then he becomes more hostile towards opposing party members, and he reacts more emotionally to information that might contradict his views on issues. Basically, he becomes more affectively polarized. So researchers have noted that sorting has been increasing, and because sorting causes affective polarization, then the affective polarization is the increases in affective polarization are due to the increases in sorting. And this is all very interesting, but it kind of begs the question of what's causing the sorting then? What's causing the sorting? But this is not the only explanation present in the literature to explain the increase of affective polarization. Another hypothesis present in the literature is the fact that there has been an increase in partisan media outlets. And partisan media outlets plausibly should increase affective polarization because they should make viewers more hostile towards members of the opposing party. But this little story I have just said doesn't find a lot of strong corroborating evidence. Even here we haven't really understood the link very precisely. It's not clear that this is the mechanism that's driving affective polarization. Another hypothesis floating around is that today it's easier than ever to go down echo chambers. So it's these echo chambers that are creating the affective polarization. I used to subscribe to this idea 4 or 5 years ago. I remember thinking, oh, this is obviously the way affective polarization is being caused by the echo chambers. Based on no data whatsoever. This is what was just floating around in my head, I remember. But if you actually go and look at the data and you look at the research, you see that the research is mixed even here. So the article proceeds by putting aside for a moment the issue of what causes polarization, and it starts asking, well, what can we do to reduce it? Maybe even if we don't know the cause, are there some mechanisms we can put in place to reduce it? Luckily there are. Correcting misperceptions about party supporters reduces hatred towards members of opposing parties. What are these misperceptions, you ask? Well, one of them is the fact that if you ask a Democrat how he envisions the average Republican, he will tell you he envisions old, rich, evangelical Christian. While if you ask a Republican how he envisions the average Democrat, he will envision a young, suburban minority. Now, actually, the average member of both parties, I repeat, of both parties, is a middle-aged, white, non-evangelical Christian. Moreover, Democrats dramatically overestimate the percentage of Republicans with anti-Muslim sentiment, and Republicans far overestimate the share of Democrats who agreed that all police were bad people. There is also a bunch of evidence that shows that the core values of Republicans and Democrats are similar, and there's far more overlap than differences, really. Yes, maybe there are some differences on purity and stuff like that, but I would venture to say that there's more moral agreement than disagreement, really. So yeah, the article is basically finished. I hope bigger YouTubers than me, YouTubers that are smarter than me, that are more rhetorically skilled than me, can talk about this issue a bit more.